Think about the best RPG you ever played on the Super Nintendo. Maybe it was Final Fantasy VI, maybe Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, EarthBound, Super Mario RPG. Take your pick. The Super Nintendo had so many we're still arguing about which one was best. And then the Nintendo 64 arrived. Better graphics, a revolutionary new controller, Super Mario 64 on day one. It looked like the future. So you walked into a game store looking for your next great RPG, and the shelf was basically empty. Almost overnight, one of gaming's richest genres had vanished from a Nintendo console. Most of us know the explanation, but that explanation leaves out the most interesting part, because Nintendo didn't just lose the genre on the N64, they created the conditions that lost it, and then almost by accident had to fix a problem entirely of their own making. What came out the other side is one of the most unlikely games ever made. Let's revisit 1997. You're in a game store. You just finished Chrono Trigger on your Super Nintendo and you're ready for whatever comes next. The N64 is on the shelf. It looks incredible. You ask the clerk what RPGs are out for it. He shrugs. There's Quest 64 coming, maybe. That's about it. You figure the console's young. These things take time. The RPGs will show up eventually. They didn't. By the end of the N64's life, it had fewer than 5 games that could genuinely be called RPGs. Compare that to the Super Nintendo, a console with one of the deepest RPG libraries ever assembled. And the drop is so steep that it barely makes sense. So, what happened? Well, as we know, cartridges couldn't hold big RPGs. Square left, Final Fantasy went to the PlayStation. Clean, simple, case closed. Except the Super Nintendo used cartridges too, and it produced so many great RPGs, which means the cartridge argument explains a reduction, but it doesn't explain a near total wipeout. Something else was going on. To understand what that was, you have to look at what the N64 was competing against. It wasn't the Super Nintendo, obviously. It was the PlayStation. By the time the N64 launched in 1996, the PlayStation had already been out for a year, and developers had spent that year discovering what CD-ROMs could do for RPGs specifically. Full motion video, voiced dialogue, orchestrated musical scores, so much content that you often needed multiple discs. The PS1 didn't just give developers more storage, it completely changed what players expected an RPG to look and feel like. And once those expectations existed, the N64 cartridge wasn't just limited, it was the wrong format for the genre as developers were now building it. The proof is sitting right there in the N64's RPG library, what little of it there is. Quest 64 came out in 1998. It was the first RPG released for the N64 in North America. It was also, by most accounts, a cautionary tale. There's no party system, no currency, no puzzles, a paper-thin story. The leveling was so slow it felt like the game was punishing you for playing it. It even saved your game to a separate controller pack instead of the cartridge itself. Now here's a question I want to ask. Did Quest 64 fail because the N64 was a bad platform for RPGs? Or did it fail because developers tried to make a conventional RPG without adapting anything? Basically, they took the same genre, removed the resources it had come to depend on, and shipped it anyway. The result answered a question nobody wanted answered. What happens when you build an RPG for the wrong hardware without rethinking a single thing? But here is the thing. Nintendo didn't get into this situation by accident. They walked into it with their eyes wide open, and they walked into it because of a single decision. By 1995, the entire games industry was moving to CD-ROM. Sega Saturn used it, the PlayStation used it. Even Nintendo had been developing a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo, in partnership with Sony, of all companies. That partnership fell apart. Sony took the technology and built the PlayStation. But the point is, Nintendo knew exactly where the industry was going, and they went the other way. When the N64 was announced, Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi addressed the criticism directly. He told Billboard magazine in 1996, I quote, "Many of you feel that CD-ROM is the call of the day, but look at the latest buzzword in the computer world, plug and play, which is nothing but Nintendo culture." End quote. Nintendo believed cartridges were faster, more reliable, and harder to pirate, all of which was true. What they underestimated was how much the RPG genre specifically had come to depend on the things cartridges couldn't do. Square saw it coming. Final Fantasy had been a Nintendo franchise since the NES, 6 games, all on Nintendo hardware. Square was, by their own description, basically a second-party developer for Nintendo at that point. But when Square's producer Hironobu Sakaguchi saw Nintendo's cartridge plans for the N64, he wasn't just disappointed, he tried to change their minds. Former PlayStation executive Shuhei Yoshida later described what happened. I quote, "Squaresoft tried to convince Nintendo to change that plan, but they wouldn't. They didn't believe in CD-ROM at all." End quote. Nintendo said no, so Square went to PlayStation. Sakaguchi explained it himself in an oral history of Final Fantasy VII. He said, "If you wanted to make a 3D action game on a Nintendo 64 cartridge with that limited space, you could do it. But I wanted to create a 3D role-playing game. The biggest problem was, of course, memory. Based on our calculations, there was no way it could all fit on a ROM cartridge. So our main reason for choosing the PlayStation was really just because it was the only console which would allow us to use CD-ROM media." And it wasn't just Square. Nintendo's cartridge decision sent a signal to the entire RPG development community. The N64 wasn't built for what they were making, so they built it somewhere else. The relationship between Nintendo and Square didn't just cool off after this, it fractured. Square programmer Hiroshi Kawai confirmed that after the split. Nintendo told Squaresoft, "Never come back." For nearly a decade, Square games didn't appear on Nintendo platforms. Final Fantasy didn't come home until the GameCube. So by the time the N64 was out in the world, Nintendo had made their choice. Cartridges, full stop. And the RPG drought was the direct consequence of that choice, which meant Nintendo now had a problem of their own making, on their own platform, and no Square to solve it for them. But here's where things get interesting. Nintendo hadn't forgotten about RPGs. In fact, after Super Mario RPG shipped on the Super Nintendo in 1996, which was developed by Square, Shigeru Miyamoto almost immediately started working on a follow-up. Developed with amateur gamers in mind, it was going to be called Super Mario RPG 2, a direct sequel. Similar visual style, same basic idea. And here's the detail that makes this story so ironic. It was originally planned for the 64 disk drive. The 64 disk drive, or DD, was a magnetic disk drive add-on for the N64, Nintendo's own attempt at a disk-based format for their console. If it had worked, it would have given developers more storage than a standard cartridge. The 64 DD launched in Japan in December 1999 and was quietly discontinued less than a year later. It never came to North America at all, which meant the game Nintendo had been developing as their RPG solution, the one that was supposed to take advantage of the extra storage, now had to ship on a standard N64 cartridge. There's an irony there so perfect it almost feels made up. Nintendo refused to go to discs, lost their RPG studio over it, built a disc add-on to compensate, watched it fail, and then had to finish their own RPG on the format that started the whole problem. And somewhere in the middle of all that, something else happened. Square, the studio that helped develop Super Mario RPG and was originally tapped to build the sequel, had already left for PlayStation. So Nintendo handed the project to Intelligent Systems, a studio better known for strategy games like Fire Emblem and Advance Wars. Not exactly the obvious choice for a flagship RPG. And then Nintendo discovered they couldn't even call it Super Mario RPG 2, because the Super Mario RPG name was tangled up in their broken relationship with Square, so the name had to go too. At this point, Intelligent Systems was building an RPG sequel they couldn't even call a sequel for a platform that had driven away the genre's biggest studios, on a format that had already failed the genre once. The only sensible response was to rethink everything from scratch, which is exactly what they did. The team tried polygons first, standard 3D visuals like everything else on the N64. The idea was rejected almost immediately, too much overlap with the Zelda games that were already on the platform. Then a new employee named Naohiko Aoyama did something unusual. In his downtime, he sketched out a rough image. 3D environments, but with flat 2D characters, paper-thin sprites in a three-dimensional world, like a picture book had been dropped into a video game. Aoyama later explained his thinking. players might be getting tired of realistic 3D graphics, and that polygonal models struggle to bring out the charm of his character designs. That rough sketch became the visual identity of Paper Mario, and the design logic that followed from it was unusually disciplined. Paper Mario's director, Ryota Kawade, later described the battle system philosophy. He said, "About half the game's production time was spent on the battle system. Two things we were careful about were, one, to make sure you were never just sitting there doing nothing for too long, and two, that the difficulty was not so high as to exclude players. No FMV, no orchestral soundtrack, no sprawling 80-hour epic. Instead, a battle system built around timing and interaction. A world that felt handmade, characters with more personality than most RPGs managed with 3 times the storage." Paper Mario released in Japan on August 11, 2000, February 5, 2001 in North America, nearly 4 years into the N64's life, close to the end of it. It was not the RPG the N64 deserved, but it was the one it desperately needed. However, Paper Mario wasn't the only RPG that figured out how to survive the N64, but the ones that did survive had something in common. They didn't try to be PS1 games on a cartridge. They worked with the format instead of against it. Ogre Battle 64 is another great example. Developer Quest took the strategy RPG approach, systems-driven, less dialogue-heavy, built around decision-making rather than cinematic storytelling. GameSpot called it a game that offered a detailed branching story and great depth of customization, both executed brilliantly within the limitations of a 35 meg cartridge. It shipped in such limited quantities that copies now go for a pretty penny. But the people who played it loved it, because the developer respected what the format could do rather than apologizing for what it couldn't. As we mentioned, Quest 64, by contrast, tried none of that. It attempted a conventional RPG on cartridge without adapting a single thing, and it became the cautionary example the genre spent years trying to forget. The pattern is clear. Adapt to the constraints, and you could make something worthwhile. Ignore them, and you got Quest 64. Paper Mario understood this better than anyone, and the result wasn't just a good game, it became the foundation for one of Nintendo's most enduring franchises. The Paper Mario series has now run across nearly every Nintendo platform since the N64. Meanwhile, the traditional Japanese RPG that fled to the PlayStation has kept expanding, longer, more cinematic, more production-heavy. Both paths produced great games, but only one of them was born from a platform telling a genre it wasn't welcome. So here's where we end up. The N64 RPG drought was real. Nintendo's cartridge decision drove away the studios that defined the genre on the Super Nintendo. Square's departure wasn't a small loss, it was a fundamental shift in who was making RPGs and where. And Nintendo caused all of this. But then something odd happened on the way. Nintendo with no Square, no disc format, a failed add-on, a name they couldn't even use, and a developer better known for strategy games, had to answer a question they'd never had to ask before. What does an RPG actually need to work? Not what does an RPG usually have, what does it actually need? Strip away the full motion video, the orchestral score, the 60-hour runtime, and the multiple discs. What's left? You're left with characters you care about, a world worth spending time in, combat that doesn't run out of ideas after the first few hours, and a story with enough momentum to pull you forward. Paper Mario answered that question, not by solving the cartridge problem, but by working around it so elegantly that most players never felt the constraint at all. The platform that killed the RPG accidentally forced someone to find out what the RPG actually was. And what came out the other side? This flat, funny, handmade little game that shouldn't even exist turned out to be something the golden age of Super Nintendo RPGs never produced. Nintendo spent the entire N64 generation fighting the RPG genre, but in the end, the game most people remember came from working with the limitations instead of trying to beat them. So I'm curious to hear what you think. What's the greatest game you can think of that only exists because of a limitation? A hardware limitation, a budget limitation, a design limitation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy gaming, my friends.